Welcome to the 2023 Peter Underwood Peace and Justice Lecture. We'll begin today with a silence. Today we are meeting on Lutruwita Aboriginal land, sea and waterways. We acknowledge with deep respect the traditional owners of this land, the Muwinina people on which we meet today. The Muwinina people belong to the oldest continuing culture in the world. They cared and protected for country for thousands of years. They knew this land, they lived on this land, and they died on these lands. We honour them. For the Muwinina people, the area around Nipaluna was their country, and they called Mount Wellington Kunyani. We acknowledge that it is a privilege to stand on country and walk in their footsteps of those before us, beneath the mountain, among the gums and waterways that continue to run through the veins of the Tasmanian Aboriginal community. We pay our respects to elders past and present, and to the many Aboriginal people that did not make elder status, and the Tasmanian Aboriginal community who continue to care for country. We recognise a history of truth which acknowledges the impacts of invasion and colonisation upon Aboriginal people, resulting in the forcible removal from their lands. Our island is deeply unique, with spectacular landscapes, with our cities and towns surrounded by bushland, wilderness, mountain ranges and beaches. We stand for a future that profoundly respects and acknowledges Aboriginal perspectives, culture, language and history, and a continued effort to fight for Aboriginal justice and rights, paving the way for a strong future. Welcome again to the Peter Underwood Peace and Justice Lecture. I'd like to extend a special welcome to Francis Underwood, who is here with us today, as well as a number of members of the Underwood family and visitors here in the Farrell Centre and joining us live online. And of course, a very special welcome to our guest speaker, Rodney Dillon. This event is held biannually to commemorate the life, values and achievements of the former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and Governor of Tasmania, Peter Underwood. Peter had a strong connection with the Friends School for many years. He served as the presiding member of the Board of Governors in the 1990s. In his time on the board, he guided the school through a difficult period, including the fundraising and rebuilding of facilities which were considered unsafe for occupation. His wife, Frances, who is here today, taught at the Friends for 24 years, including 14 years as the head of Morris Primary Years. Most of their children attended the school, and his legacy is continued today through their current descendants at the school. Peter's mantra was that we must all actively strive for peace and justice on a daily basis, which was a statement that captured his highly developed social conscience. Peter used his platform as Governor of Tasmania to advocate for Indigenous issues such as land rights and education. The establishment of the Peter Underwood Centre after his death focuses on research, partnerships and initiatives that contribute to positive and sustained change for all Tasmanians. Peter was a passionate believer in the transformative power of education to achieve his aim. Whilst Peter wasn't a practising Quaker, he has made clear through his life's work and embraced many of the Quaker values, in particular peace, justice, service and education. In 2015, the Friends School hosted the first lecture as a way of honouring Peter's life. I'd like to invite to the stage head students Maeve Bilsma and Noah Everett to introduce our guest speaker for today, Rodney Dillon.
Today, we are honoured to welcome our special guest, Rodney Dillon, to present the 5th Peter Underwood Peace and Justice Lecture. Uncle Rodney Dillon is a highly respected elder of the Palawa Nation. Rodney is the Indigenous Rights Advisor at the Amnesty International Australia and former Commissioner of the Tasmanian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission. He is currently the Chairperson of the Tasmanian Aboriginal Heritage Council and established the Tasmanian Regional Aboriginal Communities Alliance to provide a mechanism to engage and advise government at all levels regarding affairs affecting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Tasmania. Uncle Rodney has been a member of numerous high-level boards, including National Oceans, Stolen Generations, and Commissioner for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. He has been a lifelong advocate for Indigenous people's rights, particularly fishing and hunting rights, repatriation of Indigenous people's remains, and people's rights to live in their traditional homelands.
Uncle Rodney will share an insight with us today into his life work representing the rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Tasmania, including his advocacy on constitutional recognition through a voice to Parliament. This lecture marks an important step in our desire as a community to explore the idea of reconciliation with Australia's Indigenous community. This theme aligns with the school's strategic priority of producing a reconciliation action plan and our work with the Tasmanian Reconciliation Collective. We are placing an emphasis on understanding what it means to contribute to reconciliation and how, as a school, we can strengthen and put into practice what is stated in our acknowledgement to country. We believe that peace and justice are key elements of reconciliation. Uncle Rodney's knowledge and experience will provide great insight into this issue. Please join me in welcoming Rodney to the Friends School.
Thank you. Got a few notes. Like they said, my name's Rodney Dillon. My people are the Trawulaway people from the northeast. Tanganatara was my great-great-grandmother, Grandmother Smith, her daughter Mary Jane, her son Charlie, mother and me. That's my line of my ancestry from my people. And today, I'd like to thank your school for inviting me to come and talk to you about these important issues. The issues I want to talk about is the past, the present and the future. And just going back into the past a little bit, when we think about Tasmanian Aboriginals, we think about 2,500 generations of my ancestors in these lands below me. That's my wealth of my knowledge that comes from. So when I talk to you today, I talk to you about my people of the past, the present and the future. And some of the things about the past, the ancient history of this country. We think about our people living through ice ages, 2 ice ages. We think about our people living when the water rose and how they had to change and adapt. And our people have always changed it and adapted and they've been very good at making those changes at the right time and being sustainable on this land. If we think about sustainability, we think about them burning the land. I think about them farming the land right up through the Midlands, how when the invaders came, they talked about the Garden of Eden and how our people burnt that land off and continually burnt it off, and they was farming that land to farm kangaroos. The kangaroo meat would still be the most sustainable meat that we could grow in this state today. And we think about those old people having boundaries and having good governance. And some of their governance and boundaries, there was, big rivers was boundaries, mountain ranges was boundaries. We have this country here to over to there, to down to there. So they was pretty precise with their boundaries of where they was, and everyone knew, and no one broke those laws. And when people do a welcome to country, people was welcomed onto their country, but they was also welcomed off. And the reason they was welcomed on their country was so they knew what they was coming on for. People might have to come onto someone else's country for medicine, or they might just need food. But the idea of Aboriginal culture is that our group here is only as strong as the group next door that we're going to trade with or have children with. So we had to make sure that every group around us was healthy, and that way of life stood for 50,000 years, 50 to 60,000 years, and it's an ancient way, but it's a very strong way of making sure that everyone's strong and healthy, and we look after one another. Yes, we'd have disputes like everyone else, and we'd have differences like we do today, but we all had that understanding that we looked after one another and we made sure that everyone was healthy and strong. That was a bit about our past and the ancient things that our people left. The rock engravings, the middens. We talk about how important middens was, because when people come along, they could look in the midden, they could tell what food was being eaten here last, what fish was taken, or what bones is in that midden. So the midden was like the big museum. And some of the middens on the west coast are really like, they can be 30 metres high and probably 500 metres wide and probably a kilometre long. So some of them middens are very old, and it's a very old part of our history, and how many people lived in that area for how long they did. And that's why we're always very concerned when they want to drive their four-wheel drives through our middens and through our ochre sites and through our burial sites. So we're always against them doing that. And I think that, I'll jump a little bit here, but I think when we start talking about getting land back, they're some of the first areas that we should be managing. Aboriginal people should be managing their own history and their own sites in self-determination or whatever you want to call it, but our people should be in charge of looking after that. So that history that our old people left, and we know that some of the caves where they've got hand stencils in the caves and where they've used the ochre and the blood to put the hand stencils, they've put them in exactly the right spot in those caves so they didn't wash away. They're still here, 30 or 40,000 years later. And because of the history in Tasmania and the way our sites have been destroyed, we feel very vulnerable that these sites still today are vulnerable. We see what's happened on the mainland. There's sites at Bridgewater that we're fighting with people over at the moment to protect those sites and for understanding. And I find it difficult because people don't understand the importance of our ancient history, how easy it is for them to destroy it. And I think that if people did understand that history, they'd be less likely to destroy it. I don't think people would set about destroying a 50,000-year-old cultural site if they knew the importance. Like it'd be like driving a four-wheel drive over the pyramids, but they're only probably 6,000 to 8,000 years old or 5,000 years old. So I think that understanding our ancient history of who we are and what we got left after the war, I think that was they're important parts to me as the chair of the Heritage Council, but not only being a chair of a Heritage Council is just a position. I think personally, when you go to a site and you've seen it being desecrated and destroyed, it takes away a little bit of you and it makes you a little bit lesser of a person. And you feel sad, you feel angry that your old people have been disrespected. And I don't want to come across as an angry person, because I did come across as an angry person for a long time because I was angry. And I don't think I got a lot done being angry. So I do understand a bit about trying to be polite but forceful around the things we do. In thinking about my old people and my responsibility as an Aboriginal man to my old people is very important. I think of not just me as a man, but within Aboriginal history where I come from, our women had control. The women in my life, my mum, my sisters, they were the ones, we talk about Mother Earth, they're my Mother Earth. Grandmother Smith, Tanganatara, Truganini, all those people. They was the leaders of my people. They was the ones that decided what happened and where we go and when we go. Women was the collectors of food, and they made sure that our groups was looked after, that the babies was fed, that we had the right food for our people, and we moved to the right place at the right time. If you can imagine packing up 20 or 30 people and travelling from one lot of fresh water to the next lot, that's how our people travelled. It's a very well organised way of living our lives. And those old people, they knew what time of the year that the women was having the babies. We knew that, we have 4 seasons now, but our people had more seasons than that. Because we had, at the beginning of spring was when the wattle blossoms started. And we had, at the beginning of the wattle blossoms, the women had the babies, so they'd be stronger for the next year. So we had all these systems in place. We had governance, and we had all these things. We farmed our land, we burnt off our land, we burnt our land at the right time of the year. We burnt when it was cooler. If a fire was burning overnight, it was out of control. Our people didn't like fires burning overnight. And our people only burnt smaller blocks of land at exactly the right time of the year, in the autumn or in the early spring and through the winter. And the reason they only burnt small blocks is because they had a lot of respect for the animals, and when the fire burnt slow, the animals could get away from that fire. So they had this really good understanding and relationship with everything that was around them. They understood that every one of those animals had a right to be here, and they served a purpose within the circle that they lived. So that's a bit about our ancient history of who I am and where we come from. And I think of those old people many times, and thinking about how they lived through climate change, and when the water rose about 20 metres, how our people had to change and adapt to that. But they always changed and adapted. They were strong and they was resilient, and they understood this country very, very well for thousands of years. We move into the next part of this was about the word that they used. I don't know whether they use this word in the school, but when I went to school, they used the word settlement, and I really struggled with the word settlement, because I know you don't have a settlement with a gun. You have a settlement with a biro, and it's an understanding. It's an agreement between people. We didn't have that. We had an invasion. But they loosely used the word settlement because it was convenient. Convenient to hide a lot of things, and I'll just talk about a few of those things as I go through. I wonder what our old people thought when they first seen that boat come up the river with that sail on it. It'd be like today us seeing Martians landing here in a spaceship and wondering where they come from. And it wasn't long before the killing started. The murdering of our people, the guns, the gunpowder, and you can imagine out at Risdon Cove, you can imagine them people, young people as young as you, being shot, and what the other people must have thought when they picked up their bodies and carried them back to the camp. It was a pretty horrific time for our people, those next 30 or 40 years. No longer was we eating our foods where we think was eating on the run. No longer did we have boundaries. Our boundaries, we had to disregard all our boundaries because we was living under a lot of pressure. People were being killed for their land, murdered because they wanted their land. And I don't like quoting times and people, but in 1820, Governor George Arthur, he declared martial law and given people immunity to kill Aboriginal people. So it's okay to shoot our people. And the more people that was on, some of the land was quite rich, so a lot of people lived in those areas. The more people that was there, the more the people that got shot in that area. There was mass land grabs. They talked about, Captain Cook talked about terra nullius. We just talked about governance, we talked about boundaries, we talked about people farming. That doesn't sound nothing like terra nullius. It sounds like a land grab, an invasion and genocide to destroy a race of people and take away their rights. The mass land grabs went on the, like I said, on the best parts of the land because they knew that's where they could grow their sheep. And still today they've got all that land. And today we will go on later but talk about what truth and treaty may mean. Talk about Tanganatara in the northeast. We talk about Truganini, Woodery, all those old people, how they must have been feeling, trying to negotiate with a person that was killing their people right round them and right in front of them. It must have been a very hard time to do that and to try and walk that line and try and stop other people from being killed as well. That history is almost invisible. We don't talk about it. This is one of the few schools that talk about it. Until we can get schools talking about that history, we have a long, long way to go. Parts of that, I'll go backwards and forwards a little bit from here on in, but parts of that was building towns. And in those towns, they had streets called boundary streets. So Aboriginal people wasn't allowed past boundary street. So everywhere you see boundary street, our people wasn't allowed past there. And just a little bit on from that, then a couple of wars was declared. Aboriginal people was called up to go to war. And because they wasn't recognised as citizens in this country, they didn't know how they was going to do it. So they decided in the early day they wasn't going to send any Aboriginal people to war. But then they got a bit short on people to go and fight, so they decided then that the Aboriginal people could go and fight in the war. And they was used like cannon fodder in the war, like the Australians was used in the war as well. But our people was used even more so. They was recognised for their bush skills and their survival. They fought alongside white people in the trenches, defending them when they was being shot at. And they was mates when they was at war. But when they come home from the war, they wasn't recognised again. They wasn't recognised to get any of the conditions that the people got when they come back from the war. They wasn't allowed in the RSL clubs. So they was back to where they was before they started. So that was some of that history. And going through some of that, we had, just back a little bit before that, before they went to war and when they was being shot, those places named after pretty bad people who done some terrible things. We think of places like Marion Bay. They come ashore and shot the blackfellas and named the place after the captain of the boat where they shot him at Marion Bay. We think of Batman Bridge. Batman killed a lot of our people and was never charged for one murder. He was actually made a hero and they named a bridge after him. So you can start to feel how our people feel about the despair, angry, hurt, disappointed, dismay, afraid. This intergenerational trauma from what's happened in the past is carried down from one generation to the other. And it's a very real thing. It happened to a lot of our people, and it still happens after that. We had a lot of things go on when they took our children away. If any is, I think some of you kids here in grade 8 have done rabbit-proof fence. These are real things that's happened to our people. And it was only a few years ago that Kevin Rudd came out and apologised for taking the children away. Because before that it was a myth. It was a myth that they took the children. It didn't exist. And when Kevin Rudd came out and said it wasn't a matter of whether it was Kevin Rudd or whoever it was, but it actually made it real. And all them people that was there that day in Parliament, and I was there with them, and just how they cried to be recognised as people. It's a sad day, but it was an unusual day for me in my journey as an Aboriginal person. And I felt all those things again: the anger, the disgust, the hurt, afraid. All those things come back to me again. And then I look back and think about how strong our ancestors was, who stood up, and still, right through the last 200 generations. And when I talk about the past, the present and the future, I talk about my strong ancestors who's come before me, because today I can come here and talk to you as people about these things. Years gone past, my ancestors could never do that. They was too afraid and they wasn't allowed, and no one would listen to them anyway. So I have a great deal of respect for my old people, because when I've stood up and said things, I haven't been shot at. I've had a few things happen to me, but not as bad as that. And actually, Peter Underwood handed me a Human Rights Award about, 7 or 8, might be 10 years ago. Was it at the Government House when he was Governor? And I can remember him giving me that award. So I did have a relationship with that man, and he was decent to us about those issues. But it's always been hard. I look at the work I do with Amnesty is about kids in prison, 10-year-old kids in prisons. But it's not just about 10-year-old kids in prisons. It's about adults in prisons as well. And I don't know if you've seen some of those things on television about how they've treated some of our people in the prisons and driving them and treating them really badly. And it's not all the prison guards that do that, and it's not all the police officers, but you don't need many of them doing it to make it really hard on our people. The work I've done in previous on the deaths in custody, 500 Aboriginal people have died in custody in the last 30 years. And I see lots of sad faces. I see Miss Jew being thrown around not like a human being. I see Mr. Ward cooked in the back of a ute, no one held responsible. These things, once again, they're all things that don't make good history, and they don't make good relationships between us as people. But it's not everyone that does it, but the few that do it make it very hard on our people. And the work that I do with Amnesty on raising the age, locking up 10-year-old kids in prison. The international age for kids in prison is 14, but we chose to use 10 in this country because of our ancient history on it's been easy to lock people up, and especially blackfellas. If we have a look in the Northern Territory, I don't think there's been one white kid in the Northern Territory in prison for 2 years. So all the only kids that are naughty in the Northern Territory are black ones. Once again, it doesn't take many to make those changes. And I see that Dondale, when they done the Dondale Royal Commission, I don't have a lot of faith in Royal Commissions because they never do anything. Mick Gooder was on that Royal Commission. The way that the kids was being treated, they used tear gas on the kids, 10-year-old kids in a prison. It doesn't take many bad ones to make changes, but they can make it really hard on the rest. We talked about song and dance and our ancient history of who we are and where we come from. But sometimes it gets missed and left out, because only for coming here and for this school teaching it, when I go to other places, it's like it's dark behind me. There's none of my history behind me. It's invisible. All the statues and the plaques that are around the place, no blackfellas on them. They're a lot of the people that done bad things to our people on a lot of those plaques, and we totally, I'm offended by them. I don't go near them and I don't touch them, but I am offended by how they can still stand over us. Talk about the money that goes to Aboriginal community. People talk about how much money goes to Aboriginal communities. A lot of the money that goes to Aboriginal communities, I don't think, probably between less than 10 and 5% would actually hit the ground. We have a look at Aboriginal housing. It's the worst in this country. We've got 20 and 30 people living in a house. With climate change, the houses are getting hotter, and you get 20 or 30 people living in a small house. It's very hard. It's very hard for kids to do homework, and it's very hard for people to even exist in that. Then we look at our health. Our health is absolutely terrible. We still die on 12 years younger than anyone else. That shouldn't be today in this country. We should be at least equal on some of these places. We look at education. Our education system, I really worry about education, because we have kids around Alice Springs, and Alice Springs has been talked about a lot lately, about how disjointed it is at the moment, and it is. We've got kids who can understand a dreaming story that runs from Alice Springs through to Derby, and there's probably 250 song lines in that distance, and they know them off by heart, but we can't teach the kids the ABC or anything else, or maths. So I struggle to work out where we go with education. And I haven't got all the answers, because I only work in certain parts. I work in, some of the things I've worked in is repatriation, in the prisons, and in the rights to culture and defending our sites. They're the things that I've been able to work on in my life. And I went to England to talk over there about them with our remains. Many years ago, when I was about 8 years old, my mum took me up to the local graveyard, and Grandmother Smith's grave was right at her daughter's feet. And I said, "How come she hasn't got a headstone, Mum?" And she said, "They was too frightened to put a headstone on her because they was going to rob the graves. And there's a fair chance that she's not even in this grave, because Mother's uncles more likely buried Grandmother Smith up the hill before they even brought the coffin down." So it had a huge impact on me to think that I didn't even have a right to have my people in the ground. My ancestors are not where they're supposed to be, because they were stealing our people's remains and taking them back to England. So when I got old enough and got enough things behind me, I went to England to ask them for my people back. And I told them there was a bunch of bludgers and thieves, and I would not go over there and steal their people's remains. I would not do that. But they done it to mine. They sold our people's remains, and they were still using those remains all around the world for dentists and for other things. So I really struggled with that, with them having my ancestors. And then they decided which ancestors I was going to let us bring back home. It's a natural history museum. And I just really, you go into the bowels of the museum, and some of the ancestors can come back with you, but some can't. And then old people are saying, you know, why can't we come back? And you feel that really strong in your heart. Similar to what I feel when I go to Waibalina, to the mission up there. The old people there, I feel that in my heart that they're asking why wasn't I there to help them, and I wasn't. And I I feel that I disrespected them because I wasn't there. So it's a part of that understanding your responsibility to your old people. So we'll get along now to the... I wrote that much stuff through the middle of the night. I forgot what I've put down and where I put it. It was getting late and I was getting a little bit tired. But I talked about our sites, and I've talked about protecting those sites. We see that Junkin Gorge when that mining company just blew it up because there's, a few tonne of iron ore there for them. We don't have strong enough laws in this country to protect Aboriginal sites all around Australia. We see they can destroy our sites right in front of our eyes, and it tears our heart out. That responsibility that we have to our old people to look after these sites, we can't do it because the laws are not strong enough for us to do that. I've talked about those royal commissions and how ineffective they've been to our people. Each time they have a royal commission, whether it's deaths in custody, there's 339 recommendations in the deaths in custody. Very few of them was implemented, and our people still die because they are not implemented in the prison system. And it took them a while to come to the grips of understanding that they did take our children away and they had to apologise for that. And the Bringing Them Home report had recommendations, but we've still got a lot of kids, more kids today, being put in out-of-home care. And we know the out-of-home care kids go straight into the prisons. That's where they go. So we know these things, what we see is happening. I talk about a few things that's happened. Talk about Tanganatara being taken from the northeast and put on Wyberlina, and Grandmother Smith being born there. And when I went to court for taking fish to feed my family, they said I didn't have a right to take the fish because I wasn't in the same place as where I was supposed to be when they first came here. But they was the ones that removed my people. My people didn't want to move, they wanted to stay where they was. But that was their basis for my court case. So there's a couple of things come in. There's a bloke called Eddie Marbo on the outer eastern side of Murray Island. He fought that famous case in the Queensland court, but he died before the court case got up to prove that we've been here for thousands of years. So I just talked about all those things about us having governance, about rock quarries, about ochre sites, about our ancestors living through 2 generations, 2 ice ages, and yet they still want us to have proof of who we are and where we come from, just so we can have our rights back. The native title system is the poorest form of land ownership in this country. And when you do get native title to your land, you can't stop anyone else from coming in and destroying it. So we've got to look at new ways of making changes in this country. Our people, a lot of our people are homeless. A lot of our people have got substance abuse problems. There's all these issues that are still there today, and they're all forms of colonisation. Not just here, but in other parts of the world, we've got exactly the same problem where they was colonised. So I think that we need to have a look on how we change this system so Aboriginal people can be part of this country going forward, because they're not going to get on boats and go away. So we've got to work out a system like peace and justice is up on the wall here. What peace and justice looks like. Peace is not Australia Day on the 26th of January when everyone's drinking beer and eating sausages and saveloys and laughing. No one remembers the invasion and our people being shot on that day, and it's deeply offensive to Aboriginal people. And the moment we can change that, I think we will all be coming together a bit better. It's not a matter of having an Aboriginal flag or an Australian flag, but it's having us together. This is about building a country together. This country's 200 and a bit years old. It needs to mature, and yous are the people that's going to make that country mature in the future, because yous understand better. Your ancestors that come before you has never told the truth of their history, of what happened here or or where we come from. There's things coming now. We've got the Voice to Parliament, and I'm on that 19-group committee of people of having a voice to Parliament, because we need a voice to Parliament because our people are voiceless. Our people don't get a say. I see just in the past, not long ago, I was working out of Alice Springs and had a thing called a basics card. They decided in Canberra that these people up there needed a basics card because they couldn't look after their land or their money. So they give them this little green card. And I took some people from Utopia into town to get their groceries. And this lady had 2 children and a husband there with her. And they took all these, she'd picked up the trolley full of groceries, and we got to the counter and they started taking things out of the trolley and said, you can't have this and you can't have that because that's not on your basics card and you can only shop here. They had to travel 200 k's to get to the shop. So I see some of the things they put in place are very destructive and take away our pride as people. And when you take away people's pride, there's a lot in taking away people's pride and destroying who they are, destroying the people as people. And it's very hard for them to come back from that. And then we look at some of the things that's caused out of that: substance abuse, self-harm and the other things that just add up on top of what the cause is in the first place. So I think having a voice to Parliament means that if we had 2 people from each state, we could talk to the government when they're making laws. Like when they made the Northern Territory intervention, we could say to them, they took away the Anti-Discrimination Act twice. Once was in the Northern Territory for the basics card, and the other one, 3 times I think. One for native title and also one for Hindmarsh Bridge in South Australia. That was the only 3 times they dropped the anti-discrimination, human rights of our people. So I think that having a voice will be like a construction of how we go ahead and count together. Because in 1967, up until then, our people wasn't counted. It was counted as flora and fauna in this country. And when they made the Constitution, you don't think they would have thought about Aboriginal people because they didn't recognise us. So that's why we wasn't in the Constitution. So I think these are very important steps that some of you people will be voting on in the future, of counting our people in the Constitution, recognising us in the Constitution as Aboriginal people, the traditional owners of this land. I think these are going to be very important steps for this country, as we're saying. It's starting to mature. It's not at that point yet. We've had a pretty harsh last 10 years, and hopefully the next 10 will be a little better. There's also the state government is moving as well and doing a good job. The state government wants to have truth and treaty, to recognise our people, to recognise our people of the past and to recognise our history of this country so we can go ahead in the future. And this is our state government today who want to do that. And they're decent people for wanting to do that. And I commend all the people who want to make that change. And the last couple of premiers we've had have had a great deal of say in that. Mr Gutwin, Mr Hodgman and our current premier today. I think that they're very decent people because in the past, Aboriginal people have felt like refugees in this country. They've felt like that our people didn't belong here. And these are some of the things that we want to make changes in. The voice, recognised in the Constitution, probably the most important thing this country can do in maturing after 200 years is say, look, there is Aboriginal people here. Terra nullius was a lie, and we need to go ahead together in the future. We need to understand the hurt that we've caused to people and apologise for that. I'm sorry, not you people here, you didn't do it, but you can understand the hurt that still carries in the country. So I think there are steps that we need to take with the recognition here, the treaty, recognise our old people, our past, our present and our future people. recognise all these people and our way forward together, not having on the 26th of January, one lot being here and one lot being happy and one lot being sad here, or when we have international games here in the country. We see other countries like New Zealand, they have their famous dance that they do. Here in Australia, we've got lots of song and lots of ancient dances, much older than the New Zealand ones, but we don't do it because we're too ashamed. I think we need to get to the stage where we do, I see that, I think it's reconciliation where the black and the white hand together, singing an Aboriginal song and doing an Aboriginal dance. When we get to that part, I think that we will be a full country, because at the moment we're scared of the Aboriginal flag. Everyone shakes when they see an Aboriginal flag go up. I think that we've got to get to those stages of recognition of the past, recognition of today, how we feel and how we go ahead together, and having that truth and treaty, having the truth in the schools being taught, and having a treaty with the government. I'm not big on treaties because I've seen a lot of treaties fall over around the world, and I'm always frightened of having a treaty for the next generation. I think it might be better for you to have the treaty than I, but I'm happy to start that treaty, because I think a treaty is a series. It's not just one thing where we have come to an agreement and that's it. I think that as we go through generations, treaties have got to be changed, and they will be moving things to adjust to that. Until we can share the resources of this country, I see when we've got places like Murrayfield, our farm on Bruny Island, or we get back some of the abalone units, this government is making change, and we are heading down a road a bit together, but we have a long way to go and a long path, and it'll be younger people that will carry that path. It won't be us older ones to do that. So look, I think that's all for me for today, and thank everyone for listening. I think it's sort of a time for me to I feel very pleased to come here and give you this talk and tell you my story, because that's how I sort of feel about these issues. I'm only one of a group of people. I've done these things worked on this all my life, and I suppose I will keep doing it. But thank you everyone for listening, and if there's any questions, I'll be happy to take questions as well. Thank you.
So thank you so much for sharing with us today, Rodney. We might, before we formally conclude, ask if anyone from the audience has any questions to raise your hand, and we'll come round and Rodney can share his insights with us. So I might take it away if no one's brave enough to speak right now, or give you some time. I think for me, you spoke briefly about statues and how they make you and your community feel. Do you think there's importance of having commemoration of what happened in a different way, and how do you think that could look?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that having services of some sort that recognises the truth of history would be good. And I think that when they started to try and pull one statue down of Crowder, I don't think everyone understood what Crowder had done to Billy Lanner, and I think he was going to Tanganatara as well. But I think that they didn't realise the reasons why they was pulling it down. So I think there needs, before they take statues down, they need to really put the history and tell the truth of history behind that for the reason why it should be taken down, rather than just taken down. Everyone's up in arms about it being removed, because that statue's been there for a long time, and people, like our culture, we have things that we recognise, and that was one of your cultural recognitions, and I think that it was perhaps not done in a good way. It didn't worry me because I didn't go that much on the statue in the first place, but I think that because I had the history of understanding it, but the people that don't have it, because a lot of people don't even know about that history. So it's very hard for them to think, why are you pulling that statue down, and why is, the Aboriginal Army coming in to do this? Yeah.
I think that sums up the sentiment that I guess we need to remember, but it's that people don't have the understanding, and it's just this big statue.
Because it's only now that we're talking about this history. People my age, when I went to school, this history's not being told, and it's new. And I always thought them old people was redneck racist. They probably wasn't at all. They probably just didn't know. And I sort of was probably a bit wayward too far that way, and they was a bit wayward too far that way, and we didn't meet in the middle. But I think that understanding now that these people wasn't bad people because they thought to that side, and I wasn't bad because I thought to that side, it's just that the history wasn't told.
Does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask?
There's one down there as well.
Hi, you were talking about how Aboriginal people have had the many, many years of time to figure out a sustainable relationship with the earth and have a system. Do you think that Australia being able to, potentially in the future, being able to reach a point of maturity in terms of peace and justice will not only allow for Aboriginal safety but also climate action? Do you think that those issues are linked in the sense that Aboriginal knowledge?
Well, I do, because I think that, like, if we do more work around protecting the country and looking after it, the climate change is probably further than we think it is, but I think that burning country off at the right time and making sure that we do things the right way, making sure that the rivers are clean enough, the water's drinkable, and that we have this problem with water. We're very frightened when it runs into the ocean, but the water that runs into the ocean is the lungs of the earth, the lungs of the sea. The fresh water's got to run into the salt water to stop it from going too salty. So we've got to have that recycle. If we keep holding that water back and pumping it onto the land, in the end, the land will become salty, and so will the salt water. So we need to have a very good understanding of how all that works. And I don't think we've got, and I don't think they do it. They do it for profit rather than malice, I think, but we need to understand that quite clearly about how to burn, when to burn, and how to make sure that there's enough flow in the river. Like we've seen to the Murray River, the biggest river in Australia, run dry and all the fish die, like because they want to grow rice. So I think that we've got to understand what, like I said before, the most sustainable food to grow in this country is kangaroos. Now, we're not all going to live off kangaroo, but it's still the most sustainable food, and we've got to understand that.
Thank you.
I'm just wondering how the voice to Parliament is going to work in practical terms. Like, what does it actually mean? Will it be they can just present to Parliament, or there'll be some sort of power? Peter always used to have a saying, that's all very well, but what does it mean on Monday? How will it actually work?
I think that a voice to Parliament will be like an advisory committee to the Parliament, and if the Parliament's going to say, oh, we're going to bring in a basics card for the Northern Territory, they say, look, the Aboriginal people from there say, this doesn't work. We've tried this before, this doesn't work. How about we try and do this? How about we address these issues rather than just put a punitive measure on top? So I think the voice to Parliament will be like an advisory committee that the politicians will need to take advice from about the issues. How do we address housing? You know, we've gone 50 years of my life, Aboriginal housing's been absolutely terrible. How do we address that? Well, the way we can address it, when we give the money to the Northern Territory for housing and they spend it on something else and not spend it, because we're not making the states accountable for the money that we give them. And I think that's how we will be advised, and we'll be saying, we'll be watching in those reports and watching where the money's spent and saying this money's not getting to the people, or this money's not doing what it's meant to. So I think it's advice, because we've lacked that advice, and we've had people in Canberra making decisions for people in remote communities that they don't even know or even understand.
Anyone else? Or how are we doing for time-wise? Okay, well, we might wrap it up now, and we'd like to start by saying a massive thank you for sharing your wisdom with us today. And I guess in combination with the documentary, we saw you in a little bit through class. I think it really gave us a much fuller picture than we would have had otherwise. And we've got a little gift for you to say thank you for sharing with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Can we please finish with a silence?